Hello, and welcome to Sonata She Wrote. Today, I am continuing my analysis of Clara Schumann's G minor piano sonata, and will be walking through the second, slow movement of this piece. I'll again be using Aissata Connie Mason's recording, so be sure to subscribe to her if you haven't already. This movement has a number of exceptional features, including a major sonata deformation. First, the key is E-flat major, the submedian in relation to the entire work. You may also remember, in the first movement of this sonata, Schumann placed the secondary theme in this same key. Given the tragic G minor ending of the first movement, this key has strong associations with the quote-unquote if only idea, which Hepokoski and Darcy discuss in their chapter on analyzing sonata cycles. It's fairly self-explanatory, but essentially the quote-unquote if only represents a desired reality rather than the actual reality of the movement or piece. If only the first movement could have cadenced in major, if only this major mode were reality, and etc. I think this idea of unreality actually carries through this entire movement in interesting ways, so let's begin. In listening to the first movement again before I began my analysis of this movement, I noticed a potential connection between the two. This is the closing theme of the first movement, the material that immediately followed the structural cadence, specifically in the exposition. Although there are a few differences, this is a fifth, the motion is from tonic to dominant, whereas the primary theme of the second movement is an ascending fourth, from dominant to tonic, but personally, I hear a connection between these two themes, especially in regards to this if only feeling. The closing theme in the exposition of the first movement appears after an actual success, a PAC in E-flat major, perhaps implying that this movement is attempting to recapture that victory. I'm curious to know what you think about this. Do you hear any connection? In regards to the second movement's primary theme, it's also interesting that the tonic appears relatively weak in the first phrase. Ostensibly a period, this basic idea followed by a contrasting idea and a half cadence, a repetition of the basic idea here, and a brief cadential module, but in place of an authentic cadence at the end of the period, we have not only a half cadence, but in both cases, a half cadence which is blocked by suspensions. Also notice that there are no instances of the tonic chord appearing with the root in the bass voice. On the occasions when an E-flat does appear in the bass, first C and then C-flat appear as an added tone, hinting at the appearance of this augmented sixth chord here. The transition is when the reality of the first movement's tragedy begins to reassert itself. The repeated arpeggiated chords attempt to tonicize G minor, harkening back to the unavoidability of the tonic minor in the first movement. The medial caesura, arguably non-existent, is here, and I think of it as a last-ditch attempt by the transition to stop a collapse into minor. Unable to modulate into a desirous key, it's as if the transition is saying, I can't make it to major, but at least I can keep us in the tonic mode. Backing up that idea is that the cadence, or rather lack of cadence, were it not for this chromatic bass line, this would be an IAC, the third in the soprano making it imperfect. However, the bass line is present, a striking example of how these deformations can highlight expression. The chromatic ascending line provides a similar sense of tonal closure, while still highlighting the transition's inability to reach a traditional cadence and open a medial caesura. What this means is that the secondary theme has the responsibility of both modulating to a new key and articulating a cadence in that key. Brief almost to the point of non-existence, this secondary theme initially again tonicizes the mediant G minor, using a technique I've been noticing increasingly often, especially in Schubert's music. I'll leave a link in the description, again written by the musicologist Sarah Fritz, which details Schumann's admiration for Schubert's music. This is what I've come to think of as a secondary cadential 6/4 progression. I've been thinking of it like an expanded secondary dominant. The secondary dominant is preceded by its implied tonic in second inversion, which also has the effect of adding rhetorical strength to the implied cadence even when, as in this case, it doesn't actually lead to a key change, due to the cadential 6/4 progression so often being a structural cue. Long story short, this secondary cadential 6/4, in my view, strengthens the ties that bind us to G minor, even if, for now, the sonata avoids them. Perhaps seizing the available opportunity, the theme quickly cadences in B-flat major, reaching a perfect cadence here. Even with the tonic absence in the primary theme and the deformed medial caesura, this exposition is a success. It's defended against a relapse into G minor with this P-based secondary theme and cadenced in the dominant major, moving on to a P-based closing zone. The ubiquity of the primary theme, by the way, being another factor that led me to consider it linked to the closing theme in the first movement, which, if you recall, was also based on the primary theme of that movement. This movement is in dialogue with the Type 1 sonata form, a fairly common choice for slow movements. The closing zone transforms into a brief modulatory link between the two movements, which brings us back to the tonic of E-flat major. As you can probably see, given that this is the last page of the movement, there is a very serious deformation ahead. The secondary theme zone has been suppressed. There is actually a classical precedence for doing this. The examples that Hepokoski and Darcy give are both overtures. Specifically, Mozart's overture to Idomeneo and Beethoven's Second Leonore overture. The implication of a suppressed secondary theme is typically very dark, and obviously implies sonata failure. Without the secondary theme, there can be no essential closure. However, personally, I don't hear this music that way. I view this suppression of the secondary theme, and really this, quote, recap, unquote, if it can be called that, amidst the transition, secondary theme, and closing zone, as more of an attempt at damage control. The transition and secondary theme were potentially flirting with the undesirable reality too much for comfort, so the sonata has simply dispensed with them and resolved the tonal issues of the original primary theme. Rather than a period, we now have something more like a hybrid theme type. The original basic and contrasted ideas now fragmented here and here as the theme moves towards a perfect authentic cadence. You may be asking yourself, without 75% of the recapitulation, does this even qualify as a sonata form? And I have to say, I think there's definitely an argument to be made with that view in mind. I'm also aware that a common criticism of sonata theory girlies is that they tend to see sonatas everywhere, sort of a boy who cried sonata situation. Personally, I feel this movement is in dialogue with a type 1 sonata, obviously. If you disagree, I'd love to hear from you in the comments below. I hope you enjoyed this analysis of the second movement of Clara Schumann's G minor piano sonata. I will be continuing to the end of this piece, so up next will be the third movement, a scherzo. If you'd like to support the channel, you can head over to my Patreon. I am planning a series exclusive to Patreon in which I examine Clara Schumann's Lieder, but if you're unable to do so for any reason, a like or a comment goes a long way. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already.